put this all together today with all the food. That's wonderful. You'll have great food in Israel too, by the way. It will be, that to me is one of the highlights of going to Israel, is the food that we have there. But I'm going to call on Neil if he would lead us in prayer as we start our first Israel 101 session.
Let's pray. Dear Heavenly Father, we really thank you, Lord, for today, for this gathering, as we come together to really celebrate our opportunity that you've given us as Christians, as believers, as your family, Lord, to go to your land that you gave the Israelites, to go to the promised land, to see its wonders that you promised Abraham long ago. Lord, we thank you so much for this opportunity to go together as a group. We pray, Lord, that you'll deliver us safely, to open our eyes to the very opportunity to see the land that Jesus walked, that all of the prophets walked, the great battle scenes that we will know about, Lord. We'll see that the stories in the Bible become real to us and their history. And Lord, they make us look at the Bible differently, look at your word differently. Lord, we also thank you, Lord, for the opportunity to walk the way, the very steps that Jesus walked in the south side of Jerusalem. Lord, you've given us so many things, so many blessings, Lord, and you're giving us another one this coming April and May. You've given us friends, you've given us family in the church, you've given us hearts that reach out and love other people that are unlovable, Lord. You've given it to us because you loved us first. Lord, we pray that this will be a great time today and the beginning of an exciting adventure that you will give us and you will provide us and you will lead us in this wonderful country called Israel. And Lord, bless our time there and bless our time here as well. In Jesus' name.
Amen. Thank you. Well, first of all, Leah wanted me to send, my wife Leah wanted me to send her apologies. Leah has had a hobby over many years of putting on English teas. That is recreating an entire English tea. So long before even ours was scheduled, she had on her calendar a tea for this afternoon. And so that's what she's doing. She is at home doing that. She sponsors it at our home and does that. And so she will be with us our next session in the end of February, and of course the one in the end of March also, but she apologizes. I'm actually very happy to be here with you and not at the English tea this afternoon. Part of the reason is my job is always dishes. And if you know anything about an English tea, there is unbelievable amounts of dishes in it. So I usually do all of those. So I get out of that this afternoon. Thanks to you all. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Well, when we first started talking about a trip to Israel, and I know many of you were here at those first meetings, didn't April 29th, 2020 seem so far away? I mean, I thought to myself, these people are going to forget about me. They're going to forget about what even an Israel trip is all about by the time we get there. And sure enough, we're within 3 months of that. Within 3 months, we're going to be heading off to Israel. And so today, and in these subsequent sessions, I should say, that we'll be doing, I'm hoping to prepare you a little bit for that. In Israel, we will do many things, and we'll do them fairly rapidly. And I have found, or at least folks have found, and Neil and Stella here can probably be one who can tell you this along with others in the group, that a little bit of preparation really has some payoffs later on. Because when you do hit the road running over there in Israel, there are a lot of things that are happening, and just having a framework in your mind to think about things. So that's what we're doing in what I've called Israel 101. We're going to, this session and the end of February, we're going to be looking at different aspects of some background to help you appreciate what we're seeing in the Holy Land, and hopefully take a lot more in because you've done a little bit of preparation. And then our third session, which is the end of March, is going to be a very practical session about all the things that by that time you're having a lot of questions about, like packing and temperatures and security issues. And by the way, I do plan to say a little bit about security, about the present situation in the Mideast as we conclude today, just because there's been a lot of news going on several weeks ago about Iran and so forth. So I will be saying something about it today, but we will talk a lot more about those kinds of things as we get to the end of March. So in our Israel 101 sessions, here are some things that I'm hoping to do with you, which I think you're going to find very interesting, but after all, I'm the teacher, so maybe you'll have to make that judgment call. And that is, as we travel around Israel, we're always encountering the geography of Israel. You need to remember this filming and try to stay it. I'm so used to walking around here. We'll be encountering a lot of geography. We're going to briefly introduce today you to the geography of Israel, so when you get there, you'll be able to see the landforms and say, yeah, I knew that. I knew that this is what we would expect when we were in Israel. Secondly, and this part we're going to divide into two halves. Today we're going to look at a brief overview of the history of the Old Testament, and more particularly at where the sites that we will see fit into that history. Now let me use your mind a little bit, because I get excited about all these things, and I could go an hour and a half, hour and 45 minutes, not be bored at all. I am going to do all of what we're doing through pictures, okay? And the reason I'm doing that is I would like you to have a visual experience while you're here stateside, so that when you go to Israel, hopefully some of those places are going to come back to your mind that we might have talked about. So as we do this survey of history, there'll be content, a little bit of content involved in it, but it will all be based on the places that we go and the places that we see. And today's look and next week's look in the next month's look in the New Testament sites, the life of Christ and after, are also going to be picture-based. So we're going to see a lot of this history through pictures, through the places that you will actually go and you will actually see. And then, if time allows today, I may have to push this until next time, a little bit of an introduction to some archaeology. My wife's famous quote about Israel is that Israel is just a pile of rocks. And she's absolutely right about that, but in the eyes of many, these are very interesting rocks, because these rocks tell a story, the story of so much of the history of Israel. And in order to appreciate some of the things that we're seeing, I think you will enjoy hearing some terminology that we might use in archaeology. Again, I'll be using pictures to illustrate some of these things. So that's kind of an overview of the next two sessions today and the end of February, what we will be looking at together. Now this map shows where we're going to go in Israel. Did you all know that laser pointers don't work on television screens? See my laser pointer? Once you get up there, it's gone. Yeah. So we're going old school. Just like my first grade teacher had. And when I need to point to something, I'll do that. And I won't have to do that very often, by the way. And the second benefit is this, is when you guys in the front row start to when you start to doze off, I've got something to wake you up. So well, you can see Tel Aviv is, of course, where we're coming into Israel, and following the arrows here, kind of going to make a huge circle around the country of Israel. I'll go into a little more detail about how this relates to the geography as we make that circle. As we stop at different sites along the way, this will be a very typical scene, and that is one of us, primarily me, but Pastor Dan and our Israeli guide, are going to be teaching in these different sites. Now what I love about this from a teacher's point of view, and I know Dan will from a pastor's point of view, is you don't have to turn on the overhead projector and point at something on a screen. You're actually right there. You're actually living the smells and the sounds and the sights that would have been present in the site. So basically our trip is going to be traveling around, stopping at these different sites as we make our way around, and connecting these sites in your mind with biblical stories. And a lot of stories, a lot of characters and a lot of stories, and that's a part of the purpose for Israel 101, is I want to introduce you to some of them here, and then as you get over there, hopefully you will be more familiar with what to expect when we get there. So let's talk a little bit about geography in the land of Israel. Again, starting at the beginning of our, I'm going to need my pointer for this one, an old expression out of the Old Testament. It's found about 9 times in the Old Testament. Is from Dan to Beersheba. From Dan to Beersheba. We're not going to Beersheba. We are going to Dan up in the north. And this is viewed in the Old Testament starting with, I think the first appearance is in either Leviticus or Numbers. That expression is a summary of just the entirety of Israel, where people were living in Israel, from Dan to Beersheba. It's a very important Old Testament illustration. And the reason I put it up here is I want to give you some sense of how big is this country that we are going to. It's not big at all. From Dan to Beersheba, and this pretty much described, we're not going as far south as Beersheba. Jerusalem generally is about as far south. But from Dan to Beersheba is about 140 miles. Okay? Now that would be like the north part of LA to San Diego on the Mexican border. Okay? So if you can envision the land of Israel right here in Southern California, from the north part of LA down to the border San Diego area, then you have an idea of how small this country really is. And what's nice about that is we can get around rather quickly, with the exception of a few longer bus rides, but our bus rides are going to be very reasonable because we do not have long distances to go. So from Dan to Beersheba is a good way to think of this trip. Now as we look at this topographical map, getting into the subject of geography. And by the way, these are repeated for you there. I mean, you have your own copy of this in front of you there. This area right here illustrates for us 4 main landforms that make up the land of Israel. We will be traveling through all of these different landforms. On the coast is what is called geographically the coastal plain, just like it sounds. It's a very flat area. I'll show you pictures of these in just a moment. Then by the way, the coastal plain in ancient times would have been the major road between Egypt and all of, using a modern term, all of the European locations, and to the east, to the Mideast from the northern part of Israel. So the coastal plain was very, very important. There was a road that ran there. We actually will go along a part of that ancient road called the Via Maris. The Via Maris, the way of the sea, was the way that people traveled. So you might imagine, since Israel was a crossroads of civilizations, if you as an army controlled the Via Maris, you were in a very powerful position. And that's exactly what armies tried to do, whether they were Egyptians or Assyrians or Babylonians. They all tried to control this coastal plain traveling up. We will be there on our very first day and traveling up a short distance along the coastal plain. In fact, let's look at that right now. You will come in into the area. I can't use this, I keep forgetting. You'll be arriving, Tel Aviv is right by the ancient site of Joppa. And then we'll be staying in Netanya, somewhere about up here. And then we're going to make our way north along the coastal plain before we go inland on that very first day. So the coastal plain is a very, very flat and navigable area. Here's something of what it looks like. You might imagine a lot of agriculture in the coastal plain. So as we travel north, we're going to see that this is an area that is a lot of fruits and vegetables and other kinds of things are grown in Israel today. Then, second area, and by the way, you see the next landform in the distance called the Shephelah. Let me go back to that. The Shephelah in Hebrew is a word that means the foothills. And the foothills are not mountains, but they're also not plain. They're when the mountains are just beginning, and therefore along this whole strip here, keep trying to use my laser pointer, along this whole strip here you'll have coastal plains. We'll only spend really 1 or 2 days in some areas in the coastal plains, but you'll get a feel for them. This this is what they look like. Again, not mountains, but areas that would be hills and valleys and so forth. And here will be one of the most famous places that we go in the coast, in the Shephelah, and that is the Valley of Elah. Does anyone remember in the Bible what happened in the Valley of Elah? No fair, Neil and Stella, you can't answer. Anyone who has not been on a trip know what happened in the Valley of Elah?
I'm guessing it was a big battle.
Big battle, that's correct, and it's the battle of David and Goliath. David and Goliath battle, and we will go there actually toward the end of our trip into the Valley of Elah. A great illustration, though, of the Shephelah, just the mild rolling hills, and of course the armies are on each side of the valley there, and David and Goliath are going to fight down in the middle of the valley. Moving east, we move now to the central mountain range. I like to think of this in Israel almost like a spinal column. Just like our vertebrae go right down the middle of our back, the most mountainous area goes right down the middle of Israel, north and south, the central mountain range. And believe me, if you were to go, we won't be going this way, we'll be going up north through some passes in a different way. But if you were to go from Tel Aviv, the airport, directly to Jerusalem, it's only about a 45-minute drive altogether, but it is an intense climbing. You hear the bus driver shifting down on his gears and so forth, and all of a sudden you're going up into the hill country. Let's go back to this other slide. The Judean hill country. Notice agriculture now is no longer in a plain, in fields, but agriculture is now on terraces. And so in this part, in the mountainous areas, you're going to find olive trees in this case, and other kinds of agricultural that will be grown on a lot of terraces. And of course, the greatest illustration is Jerusalem itself. We're going to spend our longest time in Jerusalem. We'll be going to areas outside of Jerusalem, but that will be about 5 nights altogether, I think 4 full days in Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is just made up of hills, just a lot of hills that make up, and the reason for that is it's right in the center of this mountainous area. And then after leaving Jerusalem or leaving anywhere in the mountainous area, if you go further east, now you're going to drop into the Jordan Valley, or in archaeological terms, the Rift Valley, because it was believed, it is believed that many millennia ago, this was formed by earthquake activity. So the Jordan Valley is actually an earthquake fault that goes north and south between the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, and drops considerably in elevation. Considerably. So if you were to go from Jerusalem and drop down into this Jordan Valley, you're dropping from about 2,400 feet above sea level down to the Dead Sea, which is 1,300 feet below sea level. Now, if you're from the Rocky Mountains, those amounts aren't that big a deal. But in Israel, those are mountains. 2,400 feet for Jerusalem is considered a mountainous area. And then dropping down to go, of course, to the Dead Sea, much lower, 1,300 feet below sea level. Here's another picture here. Go back to some pictures of the Jordan. Jordan isn't that big of a river, so we know that at one time it was much larger and carved out a great deal of this valley, but you can see there in the distance the Jordan River flowing all along here. This would be Jordan, the country of Jordan. Some of you are going there in the background, and of course where we are standing is Israel, and in between Israel and Jordan you would have this Jordan Valley. And of course the Jordan River flows down into the Dead Sea. Some picture here of the Dead Sea area. We will spend one overnight, actually an afternoon and an overnight, at the Dead Sea area, an area that is very hot no matter what time of the year you're there. We're at a better time of the year in May, because it is not quite as much as it is in the summer, but still a very warm area. And when you get to the Dead Sea, we're going to take the whole afternoon for some R&R. You do not swim in the Dead Sea, you float in the Dead Sea. There's really no option here because it's 35% minerals in the Dead Sea. If you want a comparison here, the Mediterranean Sea is 3 to 5% minerals, depending on where you are. The Dead Sea is 35% minerals. So like any sea, like the Salton Sea here in our country, it just requires you to float. That's just the way that it is. So we made our way now across all of those landforms: coastal plain, Shephelah, central mountain ranges, and then down into the Jordan Valley. We will not be doing that, though, in the same way on our trip. As you can see here, as I said a moment ago, we're going to start with a little bit of the coastal plain, and then we'll make our way inland. We'll see a bit of the Shephelah, making our way inland as we make our way over to the Sea of Galilee. There we'll venture up north for a day into the far north area of Israel and see Dan and other locations up there. But then we'll spend about a half day on a bus ride down the Jordan Valley, so you get a good feel for the Jordan Rift, or the Jordan Valley that goes all the way down south. And we'll spend that night at the Dead Sea area. And it's the next day that you'll get the sense of elevation, because we're going to go up from the east side. We're going to go up from that very, very low point up to the elevation of Jerusalem and make our way into Jerusalem. After we leave Jerusalem, or I should say during one day, we'll make our way on over to the Valley of Elah, the Shephelah. We'll get a feel for some of that country there, and then finally make our way over to the airport, where we'll be leaving out of Israel again from Tel Aviv. So you can see that as we make our way in this large circle around Israel, we're actually encountering all of these landforms, these geographical landforms. That's about all I want to say about geography, just to give you a feel for how Israel is set up. When I think of Israel, both climate and geographical landforms, there are a lot of similarities to Southern California. Both the size of Southern California from LA down to San Diego, but also the landforms. In fact, when I drive out to the desert area here from Southern California, I see a lot of landforms that are actually very similar to Israel when you're traveling in Israel. So there are many similarities to the place where we live in comparison to Israel. Let me stop there and ask, do you have questions about geography? Or any in general?
Is it humid or no? It's as humid as it is here.
Different parts, it's different humidities. We'll be there at a very good time in May, so the temperatures are much more moderate, somewhere around high 60s through the 70s, depending on the day. So in the 70s, generally, on the average, is about as warm as it's going to get. I say that for a few of you who have been on trips with us before, when we went in late June, and we were well into the 80s and sometimes even into the 90s. Now, where the difference of humidity comes is up in the Galilee area. You'll have more humidity up here, but once you get down to the Dead Sea area, very, very, very dry. Not nearly the humidity in the Dead Sea area. So it all depends on where you are in terms of the humidity that you would have. Any other questions before we move on here?
Where's Jordan? Is it right in the hills by the Jordan River?
Yeah, I keep trying to use this. Yeah, Jordan would be right on this side of the Jordan River.
Trans-Jordanian.
So after a certain area, there's a border line here between Jordan and Israel that go up, and all of this on the east side of the Dead Sea is Jordan. All of this is Jordan. Up in this area, Sea of Galilee and north, this is where you get into the Golan Heights area, and there it's been occupied by Israel since 1967. Technically speaking, they've occupied territory that was once Syria, but no one's arguing at this point that Israel is still well in control of the area. And the Golan Heights area is a very, very strategic and important area for Israel from a defense point of view. So with the question of why would we assume that they're going to be in control? If they gave up control of Golan Heights, it would be very difficult for them to defend themselves. So Golan Heights is an area that we travel through just, even though it's occupied by Israel, we travel through it as if it is Israel, all of the places we go and everything.
So Dan is in the Golan Heights?
No, Dan is actually is in Israel, and the Golan Heights, would be more from around right about here. Yeah, it would be more extending on into the east. Dan, though, is definitely very solidly in Israel. When we go up to Dan, we will go up to the area of Israel that has Lebanon just a few miles to the north. It has Syria just a few yards, where we will be a few yards to the east. Remember, not a lot to worry about right now because Syria is not strong in any way, even though I know they've been mobilized by the Iranians and by Russia. None of these areas are dangerous right now. I could tell you stories in earlier days, in the 1990s, where the Lebanese, the Hezbollah, were tossing rockets over from Lebanon into northern Syria, and it happened to be the year that the movie Braveheart came out. And so the guys on the trip, these would be college students, these would be Biola guys. The guys on the trip were watching the tanks come alongside of our bus and say, we want to see some action. And all of us as leaders were saying, no, we don't want to see action. We want to get out of here. But I had my daughter and my son-in-law, future son-in-law, along on that trip, and we went right up there to the border crossing into Lebanon. And at that time it was safe to do that, but it was later on a very tense area. And so I have my daughter standing with a couple of Israeli soldiers. Still can't believe they let her do this. She's holding an Uzi, a machine gun, with these Israeli soldiers on both sides of her, and I'm thinking, this was not my idea of what an Israel trip was going to be all about. But that area actually has become much safer, if you can believe this, partly because the strength of Lebanon and Syria have been rather neutralized in recent years. So that going up to the northern borders, we call that day, is not nearly as tense as it was at one time. The area that's a little more tense that you probably hear on the news is Gaza, down in the southwest. And Gaza, with the Palestinian headquarters set up there, can be one of the more tense. But we don't go anywhere near Gaza, to be honest with you. We're not anywhere near Gaza. But the area up north is an area that is very near the two borders of both Lebanon and Syria. Okay, I'm going to move us on here to talk a bit about history. And let's make this fast moving with a lot of pictures. To kind of get a framework here, I think this was included in your notes as well. I like to divide the Old Testament, at least the part of the Old Testament that we talk about the most, from Genesis 12 on, into different groups or different periods of time, and you have the dates of those times there. And what I'm going to do is illustrate for you how in the earlier periods we have just a couple of examples of the places that we see that relate to the patriarchal period and the conquest and the judges period. But then as we get into the United Kingdom period, that would be Saul, David, and Solomon, we find that there's much more that we will see, and that is the most prolific of the periods of time, in history at least. And then again, phasing out a little bit as we get into divided kingdom and solitary kingdom. So I'll just illustrate these different periods of time with some of the various characters. Now, Abraham, a good date for Abraham is to think of him as being born in around 2100. It's not exactly that, but approximately 2100 BC. Now I want to show you something that shows how far back we're going to go in time, and it's actually a very exciting place to visit. Lord willing, we will stop at a restaurant in Jericho as we make our way along the Jordan River. And that restaurant allows us, after eating at the restaurant, to go up on the tell. I'll explain a little bit later what a tell is. It's the ruins of ancient Jericho. As we get up onto this tell, the most amazing part is not where Joshua's wall might have fallen down. I don't think we really even know exactly where that is in Jericho. But the most amazing part is a tower or a building of some kind that was preserved that is literally dated to 8000 BC. Now try to wrap your mind around this a little bit. Abraham lives as many years before Christ as we live after Christ. We're in 2000 AD, he is in 2100 BC. This is 4 times that long, 8000 BC. You will see and are looking at here the oldest excavated building in the world. And Jericho is considered to be the oldest excavated site in the world as well. So a very, very ancient and old, this is way before the patriarchal times, but I wanted to throw it in and show it to you. We will also see on our very first day, and I have to warn you that many of you who are on the trip, on the group leaving here from LA on the first day of the advertised trip, you're going to be jet lagged that first day. So I'm encouraging you to kind of take as much of this in because you're going to be feeling a bit jet lagged as we make our way over to the Sea of Galilee. But one of our stops along the way is going to be this period, Bronze period is called. It's the site of Megiddo. It's one of the most famous archaeological sites, and you can see why my wife says this is just a pile of rocks. The reason I wanted to show it to you is there are different layers, about 26 different layers in Megiddo of 26 different civilizations that lived in Megiddo. And this particular rock structure here was evidently a sacrificial site. Now, when I was there with the Bible students, we had one of our students lay on the sacrificial site to be offered. We were just joking around. I'm amazed we got to do this because you can't get anywhere near that today. The officials will never let you go down and lay on one of the sites, but we were able to pull that off. And but that's what this likely was, a sacrificial site, probably 1,000 years before Abraham. So I'm giving you some very old examples of what we're going to look at. This would be around 3000 BC, or in a period that is often referred to as the early Bronze period. Now is when we get to the interesting stuff. Up in Dan, which we're also going to stop, we're going to be going to from the Sea of Galilee area. This will be about our 3rd day of traveling. Up in Dan, we're going to see the ancient gate. This is a gate. It seems like a door, but it's a gate to a city, and the brown mud type of bricks are the city wall of ancient Laish. Laish ultimately became Dan, but Laish was the name that goes all the way back to Abraham and before Abraham even. Laish is a very, very old city. These are mud bricks, and you can see quite a number of years ago a protective canopy that was built over the top to try to protect these from the weather. When I first started going here in the late 80s, early 90s, there was no protection whatsoever. It was amazing. And wisely, they put a lot of money into protecting this. But this gate of the city would have existed at the time that Abraham, and we know from Scripture and the patriarchal stories that Abraham visited this city. So in my mind, it's not an exaggeration to be able to say that Abraham probably walked through this gate. That's as far back as we can go with the biblical characters and be able to see something quite authentic. But I'm always thrilled to go there and to see something that literally would have been standing when Abraham was there and he would have entered the city from that time. So moving from patriarchs to the conquest under Joshua and the Judges period. Again, just jumping back real quickly to Jericho. We will not be able to see, I don't want to promise you something that you won't see. We will not be able to see a good representation in Jericho of probably where the walls came tumbling down. If any of you have ever done any reading on the walls of Jericho, you know that in early days when Jericho was one of the primo sites for excavation, there were several identifiable places where the walls of Jericho during Joshua's time may have been. And there were debates even, there were articles written on debates as to where these walls are. One particular one that I tend to agree with, that site, that part of the excavation, actually showed that the walls would have had to fall outward rather than being broken inward. That would fit very nicely with the story of some kind of a divine judgment where God himself knocks the walls of Jericho down. But sadly, through many, many years of wind blowing and rain, not a lot of rain in this area, but the deterioration of this site has been rather extreme. And so we will not be able to really definitively look at a place that we could say, well, this is where the walls of Jericho would have fallen down. I do find, though, this 8,000-year-old building, or 10,000-year-old building, to be an amazing part of this site altogether. On our first day, we'll also look out from a great viewpoint over the Valley of Jezreel. It's called Gideon, one of the judges, his activity would have been carried out in this area. King Saul, later following the judges, would have also had activities out in this area. But a story we often forget about when we go to Bethlehem, a story we often forget about because Bethlehem is so connected with Jesus, is that Ruth and Boaz of the Ruth story lived near Bethlehem. And so when we look at the shepherd's fields and we talk about Bethlehem, we most often are thinking of Jesus, but we can also go all the way back when Ruth and Boaz lived, that they also would have lived in the same area in the Old Testament near Bethlehem. And then we get to the United Kingdom, a total of 120 years. Each of these three kings, Saul, David, Solomon, ruling for about 40 years of that time. Again, Saul carried out much of his activities with his sons, I should say, plural, out in this area. In fact, Mount Gilboa, I'm not sure it'll be clear enough to point out to you Mount Gilboa, but from this site, you can see Mount Gilboa was where Saul and his sons died at the hands of the Philistines. They would have been killed by the Philistines on Mount Gilboa, and that is found out in this valley of Jezreel. The scripture tells us, though, that the Philistines, in order to shame Israel, brought the bodies of Saul and his sons, brought them to Beit Shean, and they were hung on the walls of Beit Shean. We will be going to Beit Shean. This is south of the Sea of Galilee after we leave the Sea of Galilee. The bottom part of Beit Shean here is an amazing Greek-Roman city that has been extensively restored. And we will be going there and probably giving our greatest attention to the Greek-Roman city from the time of Christ, and a very interesting reconstruction of that city. But a few of you who like hiking, and I'm always game for a good hike, will head up this, it's actually a stairway. It goes all the way up the hill, a trail, all the way to the top, for no other reason other than to say that we did it. What we are climbing up when we do that is the Old Testament tell of Beit Shean. So you have the Greek-Roman city down below, that's a New Testament site, and then you have the Old Testament tell. That's not a mountain or a hill there, that's actually a tell with different layers that were built. And it's there where Saul and his sons in the scriptures would have been, their bodies would have been placed on the walls of Beit Shean. I usually like to throw in a few good hikes for those of you who like hiking. And it's fun to do that if we have the time, but not required for everyone. Now we get to David, and it's here, David just has so much, I need to move quickly on this one. David was a shepherd, you may remember. So when we're in Bethlehem, where David is growing up, we might see a shepherd like this. You still see them out with their flocks in the fields. Of course, we're going to talk about the shepherds in the birth story of Jesus, but this very much represents David also growing up, because his job was being a shepherd for his father in the Bethlehem area. We also are stopping at a couple of other spots that relate to David's earlier years before he became king. They're circled here in Gedi, and over here it would be the Valley of Elah, once again. En Gedi is a beautiful reserve. It's a nature reserve, actually, where animals and plants and others have been protected by the Israeli government. And as we walk back in there, we won't have to walk very far, but as we walk back into En Gedi, we're reminded in Scripture, including in the Psalms, that this is where David retreated when he was running away from Saul, and when he also went just to be alone. And David would go into En Gedi, and there's good reason to believe that several of the Psalms were actually written right there in En Gedi. You can see this is actually literally coming out of the desert area of the Dead Sea, and now we get into this beautiful area of waterfalls, and you can see why David might have been refreshed there. I've already mentioned Valley of Elah. This also would be a place where David first distinguishes himself as a great leader. He has the courage and the faith to stand up to the Philistines and to stand up to Goliath. And the contrast is so obvious there between David and Saul, because Saul was very afraid of the Philistines. All that takes place there in the Valley of Elah. There's actually still a brook that runs through the Valley of Elah at times, during the rainy season especially, rocks in the brook. And so you will, if you know the biblical story, you will go find your 5 smooth stones. I don't know if you remember this. David goes to the brook in the Valley of Elah and he finds his smooth stones. I brought a lot of them back myself on these trips, and just a great remembrance of this. By the way, this is a story I've heard confirmed by several people who actually work in Israel, so I have good reason to believe it, that every year the Department of Tourism goes in and dumps some truckloads of rocks. Yeah, it kind of took away from the story. Dumps these truckloads of rocks in there because they know tourists like to find these stones in the brook of Elah. But whichever ones you find, they will be authentic. You can go all the way back to David's time with those. They will be authentic for sure. Now, David becomes king after what is maybe about 13 years of running around. Saul is pursuing him in the wilderness, but he does become king. One of the first things he does is to move the capital city from Judah up to Jerusalem. In order to move to Jerusalem, David had to conquer a very, very difficult group of people to conquer called the Jebusites. They had been in control of Jerusalem. At that time, the name of the city was Jebus, Jebus, Jebus. And so David goes with his armies, and he is going to conquer the Jebusites and take over Jerusalem. And it's here we run into some of the most interesting stories about David's city and what he starts out to do. Now, when you and I think of Jerusalem, and here would be a modern picture, we're over here on the Mount of Olives, we're looking over at the Temple Mount. The Temple Mount is what grabs our attention more than anything else. But the Temple Mount was not the city of David. And what I want to do with a few slides here today is to show you exactly where the city of David was, because to be very honest, when we get over to Israel, you're not going to have as great a sight as we are in this room today. And the reason is I'm going to use aerial photographs. And aerial photographs help you to see much better. I discovered this through quite a number of trips, taking tour groups there, is you just can't find a good spot to really clearly see the city of David like we will today. So I think if you have where it's located in your mind when you get over there, it won't matter because you kind of know where the city of David is located. On a graphic, this This is the Temple Mount we were just looking at. The picture we looked at would be from someone looking from the Mount of Olives. The Ophel is an area that Solomon did a lot of work in and built up. But notice where the city of David is located. City of David is located actually further down the hill from this Temple Mount area. And we'll talk about why that is in a minute. Now, here are the aerial photographs that I think are very helpful to see. Here's that Temple Mount once again. And here is the city of David, outlined here. This would be the original city of David that David conquered from the Jebusites, and he built up to be his city as well as the city for future kings. I have a few slides here to kind of give us a better feel for this. This is the city of David right down here. And we're actually going to one day be scheduled to go on a walking tour through City of David. They've done a beautiful job of taking what used to be a fairly rustic area of Jerusalem and making it into a great tourist center where you can walk right through the City of David and you can see a lot of things. And when you're there, just remember that we're quite a ways down from the Temple Mount area, and this would be the City of David. What's helpful in picturing in your mind is to think of different valleys that form this city. The deepest of the valleys is the Kidron Valley, and then another valley comes in from this direction, the Hinnom Valley. Not existing today, but it did in David's time, was another valley that went through right through here. It's now covered over and leveled out, called the Tyropoeon Valley. So when you think of City of David, once again, here's looking from ground level. This would be the Kidron Valley. Down here, somewhere not on this photograph really, is the Hinnom Valley. And the Tyropoeon Valley would have gone right by this side of the City of David. What made the city so defensible for the Jebusites and later on for David were the high cliffs that would have gone up. And if you notice the depth of this Kidron Valley, you'll see that when you go to Israel. Archaeologists estimate that probably in David's time it was twice as deep as this. So how did it get to be half as deep? Well, likely the 70 AD and destruction of Jerusalem, and the Romans pushed a lot of the debris down into that valley, and then just generally wind and other things have filled it in with a lot of dirt. So the deep valley that we see today that defines the City of David is really not nearly as deep as it would have been in David's time. So it was a very, very defensible city. Now, one question remains as we talk about City of David, and here again is another great vantage point, great picture right here is City of David. There's a question, why did David build his city down the hill when the mountain, the Temple Mount, was available to him? And I'll give you a hint. The answer to that question is found right on this slide. The answer is found right on this slide. Why did David not build his city up on top of the mountain? And why did he do it down below?
Pool of Siloam.
I heard it over here. The Pool of Siloam was a part of this, but this is the only place there was water. This is the only place. This is why the Jebusites built here. This was the only location. Now, in modern Israel, there are artesian wells that bring water to all the old city area and so forth. They've been drilled down deep for quite a few years. But in David's time, the Gihon Spring was the only source of water. And so water, as you might imagine, extremely important in the location of a city. So David followed the Jebusites in claiming this particular city because of the water supply that was there. And we'll get to a moment in the Pool of Siloam, which is also part of the story here, and we'll see how that all fits together in the whole water system. So, when David conquers the city, the scripture tells us that he sends Joab, his general, down into the water, and down, I should say, to the city, and Joab's men climb up the water shaft and enter the city secretly, and then they open the gates and allow the armies of David to come into the city. There's one theory that you'll see when you go to David's city, and that is there's a water shaft called Warren's Shaft. I think it's a pretty good theory actually myself. And Warren's Shaft is viewed by some as the actual shaft where David's men would have climbed up, come into the city, and then of course open the gates and allow the city to be conquered. We don't know that for sure. There's a debate about that, but it certainly is a good candidate for a place. And you'll see Warren's Shaft. You'll actually be able to go down and to look at that. This is a picture from quite a few years ago before the beautiful new visitors center was used. But this picture shows a huge structure, a stepstone structure that had been built all the way before David's time. And while it seems like it might have been a building or like part of a building, more likely what this structure represents is the foundation on this very steep terrain on the edge of a valley. It's the foundation leading up to David's palace. And so many archaeologists believe that right above this stepstone structure, here's a close-up of this, right above this structure would have been where David's palace might have built. And it certainly makes sense because the palace would have then been at the top of David's city and the people below. Now I want to make just one observation, and it's a really interesting one to me because I preached this passage, taught this passage many times. Here we have not David's city, but Silwan, a part of the little town of Silwan. And where we're standing with this picture is just looking across the Kidron Valley to Silwan. But this is very much like the terrain of David's city. You can see how steep it would have been. And, I might add, you can see how if David's palace is at the top of this city, that all of the houses in the city of David would have been below David's palace. It sheds some little new light, doesn't it, on 2 Samuel 11, the story of David and Bathsheba. Because David is able to view from his patio, is able to view a woman bathing down on her patio. Every house in the city of David would have likely been below him, if we can picture the terrain of David's city. So I think it's helpful sometimes to be able to visualize geographically some of these things, and it makes a lot more sense in the stories that we have. And then finishing up here with David and Solomon, ultimately a temple is built. You may remember that God didn't allow David to do it, though. He, in a sense, is bringing a judgment on David for his zealousness as a warrior. He was a man of war, according to God. But he does allow his son, Solomon, to be the builder of the temple. We don't have a temple today, so there's speculation, but I think very, very good and accurate speculation on where this temple would have been. Today, and I'll get to this subject next week, today on the Temple Mount, we have two very, very holy Muslim worship sites that exist on the Temple Mount. On the left is the Al-Aqsa Mosque, the third most holy Muslim site in the world. Mecca, Medina, Al-Aqsa in Jerusalem would be the holy sites for Muslims. And we'll get to that story next week as we talk about 700 AD is when these buildings were built. But most believe that right next to the Dome of the Rock is where the temple would have stood. So we will, and again, I'm going to have to throw out a caution on this one. If this political situation is like we would like it to be, we will be able to walk up on the Temple Mount. I'm not going to promise that to you, because I have had groups go that simply ran into a bad day. And the bad day, what I mean by that is there were tensions going on between the Palestinians and the Israelis. And when that happens, to a certain degree, they actually shut down the Temple Mount. The reason is obvious here. Many Muslims are gathering on the Temple Mount, especially on Fridays, for their worship. Jews aren't necessarily interested, but many Christians are coming up on the Temple Mount as we would like to walk around the Temple Mount at least a short time. And so when that happens, they sometimes will just shut down the Temple Mount. I've never regretted that they did that, because I don't want to take a group up there if tensions are high. So we'll just have to see on the day that we go, that we're scheduled to go up on the Temple Mount. We would not be going unless things are working just fine. If we do, though, I'll be able to show you exactly where that location is, where the temple would have likely stood. And by temple, I mean Solomon's temple, later on destroyed, remember, and then rebuilt under Ezra and Nehemiah, and so first and second temple were built on the Temple Mount. All right, I'm looking at my clock here. I think I'm going to take right now a 5-minute break, and invite you, if you want to take a bathroom break, that would be great, and also any of the food that you'd like to get. Let's plan on 5 minutes, or as close as we can do it. Bring it back to your seat, and we'll just move on here in about 5 minutes. Oh, good for me. Still picking up your food. Let me reassure a few of you. I talked to a couple of you at the break. The kind of content that we're doing today, in other words, this geographical and historical survey and all of that, is going to be very different from what we're doing in Israel. And I would add, we're going into quite a bit more depth today to try to just lay a foundation for you. Because when we get to Israel, mostly how I would describe our teaching is it's simply taking Bible stories that happened at this place and explaining what you're looking at that can help you to understand the Bible story. And then finally, being a pastor, I can't escape this. How does this apply to my life? What is the relevance? How does God want to use these things in my life? So the kind of teaching I think you're going to find is not a Talbot Seminary education on these areas, but it is more trying to help you understand your Bible better. My whole goal is that when you get back, and let's say Pastor Dan is preaching on a certain passage, and we've actually been there, that you will have in your mind this visual image of where you were, and maybe even remember a few things about that place. And it will be a help to you as you read your Bible, as you listen to a sermon, or whatever the case is. So our time in Israel is going to be definitely looking at Bible stories and interacting with them and talking a bit about it. And it's not going to be heavily academic in the sense that we're doing today. One other difference I would say, as you can already tell, is today we're doing a chronological look through history, and we will next time we meet. Whereas in Israel we are going site by site. And so literally at a site in Israel, you might have 3 or 4 different Bible stories that all happened at the same place. And one of them might be an Old Testament story, and one of them might be a New Testament story. Because remember, all of the biblical history that we have happened in Israel. So the reason I'm going through this a little more chronologically is hopefully to help you have a frame of reference, so that when you do get to Israel, you won't have that sense of jumping around everywhere and you'll be completely lost. That at least you can fit some of these into the place. All right, let's talk a bit about this next period. I'm going to go over these a little bit more briefly than we did David and Solomon. You may remember after David rules, his two sons, or I should say his son Rehoboam, and one of his famous generals, Jeroboam, could not see eye to eye on things. And literally a dispute over taxes and whether people would have to pay their taxes resulted in a split of the kingdoms. The general who was responsible for this split was Jeroboam I. And this is what we call the divided kingdom, because now we're actually going to have 2 separate kingdoms after David and Solomon have united everyone. One of them is in the north called Israel, and the other in the south called Judah. And Jeroboam, this general now who gathered attracted many people to go up to the north in the green area that you see, Jeroboam knew that he had a problem. At least as a politician, he had a problem. Jerusalem, circled here on the map, Jerusalem was where everyone was commanded to go at least 3 times a year to go and renew their covenant with God, and they were to go back for the festivals and the feast days. Jeroboam knew that if all of my people up in the north go back for those 3 days and see their friends and gather together, I'm going to lose them. They're going to be a rebellion against me, and I'm going to lose my kingdom. So he came up with an ingenious method to try to keep them. It wasn't a spiritual one at all, but after all, he's a pragmatist, he's a politician. And that was to build 2 centers of worship, alternate centers from Jerusalem. And they're pictured here on the map. Bethel in the south and Dan up in the north. We will not be going to Bethel, but we will go to Dan. And at these places, Jeroboam invented or developed a type of worship that was going to allow people to worship. I think his intent was to still worship Yahweh, but he was going to do it in a way that was totally against the Old Testament law. His intent was to worship through a golden calf. Does that remind you of a story? It should. When Moses doesn't come down the mountain, what does Aaron do? He sets up a golden calf for worship. It's exactly what Jeroboam does. We will travel to one of those high places where Jeroboam set up his golden calf worship in Dan. And we'll stop and talk about this story in a little more detail. I like authenticity, and here you can actually see at the lower part of the altar, you can see some of the stones that Jeroboam's men in 930 BC or thereabouts would have actually laid for the foundation of this worship site. And then here would be a recreation made out of metal of what the great altar might have been, where the sacrifices would have been made at the high place in Dan. We'll sit there, and this is one of the sites where we're just a few yards from the Syrian border, but I think nowadays very safe. No activity has gone on there for a long time. And the high place in Dan is a place where we can remember the story. The reason this story is so important is because golden calf worship originating here seems to be the slippery slope that ultimately ends up in Baal worship. And most of you know that Baal worship was a very, very serious departure from the law. This site, we've looked at it several times, but this site would represent the stomping ground or the controlled area of Ahab and Jezebel. And it was Ahab and Jezebel in the valley of Jezreel who began to import Baal worship from Jezebel's home area, the Phoenician area, and she imports it in here. And so this slippery slope of golden calf worship moving on into Baal worship was a very, very powerful thing. There was only one man who had the courage to take a stand against Ahab and Jezebel, and we'll be remembering that story up on Mount Carmel. This will be your first day there, so again, some of you will be jet lagged, but I'm going to, if I see you're jet lagging, I'm going to try to shake you, because if there's one story I don't want you to miss, it's the story of Elijah on Mount Carmel. We will go to Mukraka, which is the traditional site of where Elijah may have called down fire from heaven. It's the highest of a series of mountains, and in 1 Kings 18 is where we find this story. And of course, as we go over the story, the ending of the story is that Elijah, following the command of the law, that a false prophet was to be executed. Elijah then slayed all the prophets of Baal who were falsely prophesying there on Mount Carmel. A very dramatic story, a very powerful story, and we will talk about that story on our first day. So even if you're jet lagged, I'm going to wake you up, and hopefully we'll appreciate that story. In the same area, we also have gone by Megiddo. Ahab and Jezebel also built another a water tunnel. We're going to look at a second water tunnel here in just a moment in Jerusalem. But this water tunnel is very, very nice and updated. As you can see, there's a nice walking platform to walk through it. Some of you may choose not to do it, and that's fine, but it's not a claustrophobic kind of feeling at all. There are electric lights all the way through it, and so you can walk through. And the purpose of a water tunnel, this is one of two that we will see, was so a city could bring in water from a source outside of the city, could bring the water supply into the city, and they could disguise or cover over the water supply outside so the enemy would not know where their water supply is. The number one way that an enemy conquered a city was to cut off their water supply. And if the water tunnel provided a way to bring water in, it was very, very important part of the life of the city. This one Ahab and Jezebel would have built, and in a moment we'll get to another one, in fact, very short time here, in Jerusalem that was also built as a water tunnel. So we come to the end of the divided kingdom period, and the first major invading group to conquer the northern kingdom are the Assyrians. This was in 722, and the Assyrians, of course, take many of those northern kingdom people away into captivity, leave few of them there, who ultimately become a mixed breed of people. The Samaritans actually come out of that group. We're now left with one kingdom, the solitary kingdom. At this point, when the Assyrians have conquered the north, and they're threatening to come down and conquer the south, we have a very interesting and dramatic time in Israel's history. Had it not been for a very godly king, Hezekiah, the Assyrian army was quite capable of coming all the way south and conquering both kingdoms. But it was Hezekiah's great faith, and I might add, alongside of him is the prophet Isaiah, and Hezekiah and Isaiah together take their stand against the Assyrians, and ultimately the Assyrians give up and go home, and it leaves us with one solitary kingdom. We'll look at a couple of things that Hezekiah did during this time in Jerusalem. This is actually a wall, a portion of a wall that is built in a part of Jerusalem. You would never imagine this is in the old city of Jerusalem, and all of a sudden you're looking down into a viewing area, and here is this wall. But it was a very important part of the wall, because the northern part of Jerusalem was very vulnerable to enemy attack. They had not built an effective wall on that part. And so what Hezekiah does evidently, and I'll give you some evidence of this when we're looking at this wall, is he throws together a wall very, very quickly. And this is the portion of that wall on the northern part of the city that Hezekiah does to try to get ready for the invading armies of the Assyrians, the war machine, as they come south. Another thing that he does is related to what I said just a moment ago about water tunnels. Hezekiah knows that the Kidron, Gihon Spring, I should say, is very vulnerable outside of the walls of the city of David. So he knows he somehow would like to bring water inside the city of David, bring it underneath the bedrock of the city into a pool inside the city. And he does this by building a water tunnel. Now you can see here that here's the Gihon Spring outside of the wall of the city. And ultimately the engineers and workers dug a underground tunnel through the bedrock about 600 yards long, if you can imagine this, about 6 football fields total in length. Dug it all the way in to bring water inside, and of course then this Gihon Spring would have been disguised or covered over on the outside so that the Assyrians would not know where their water supply is. This particular water tunnel provides for us, and I won't say all of us, but a few of us, an Indiana Jones adventure. Because you are still allowed today to go through Hezekiah's tunnel in Israel. It is not for the faint of heart. And were my wife here right at the moment, I would actually have her give a testimony, because Leah has never been through Hezekiah's tunnel. And she knows she can't do it because she has claustrophobia. This is not like the tunnel that I showed you with Ahab and Jezebel building it, where there's electric lights and kind of a wide area and a nice walking area. This is a very tight tunnel. And I'll say this today, and I will say this also when we're in Israel, that it is not for the faint of heart, but if you think you can do it, you don't want to miss it. I always look at, I've never been to Israel without walking through Hezekiah's tunnel. It's kind of been one of those adventures. So this is the beginning of the tunnel here. And it's cut through the bedrock, as I said, about 600 yards long, in a few cases turning corners and so forth. There is water running through the tunnel, though at times of the year the water is less. The least that I've ever had would be the water running up to my ankles. The most that I've ever had would be the water up to about my calf area. In modern times, the water need in Jerusalem is so great that there really isn't a lot of water running through this tunnel. So it's not that the water is an issue. What is an issue is, let me show you a few more pictures here, is the sides of the wall. I'm only 5 feet 9 high, and there are times when I have to duck in this tunnel. Not all the time, but some of the time in this tunnel. So a word to the wise, don't be like one of our Biola students who didn't tell us that she has fear of tight places, and she actually got to the middle of Hezekiah's tunnel and had a panic attack. We had a very difficult time getting her out of there because you can't turn back. Don't be like that student. You need to be honest with yourself. I'm not going to ask you to tell me whether you're going to do it or not, but you'll walk through with some kind of water shoes, and that will be in your packing list, that you'll want to have something along just for this tunnel. As you can see here, you'll carry a flashlight, because once you get down into it, there are no lights. You're all on your own, but everybody's carrying a flashlight, so it's quite a bit of light. And then you're just making your way at whatever pace, and usually we just move along at a steady pace, about 30 to 40 minutes or so inside Hezekiah's tunnel, right through there.
I noticed you're not wearing a backpack. Do you have to remove backpacks because of the size of the space?
Yeah, no, I'm holding one down here.
Yeah.
But most people, well, I would not encourage even carrying one along. Friends of yours who are going to choose not to go will accompany my wife Leah, and will go around. They will go around. There is a tunnel, by the way, but it's called the dry tunnel. Some of you, I don't know if any of you have been through that tunnel. It's not the compact, and it's not nearly as long as Hezekiah's tunnel. So you just get other people to carry stuff for you, other than what you absolutely need, which is a flashlight and walking shoes and so forth. Yes.
How clean is the water?
Oh, it's clean. This, if you can believe this, Gihon Spring is a spring that existed when the Jebusites were there, and it is still bubbling up water today. Gihon Spring, every so many minutes, is bubbling up water. So this is spring water out of the ground. It is not anything to worry about. Yes?
So there's good airflow through the tunnel?
Yes, that's an excellent point, airflow. If airflow helps you, there is always a nice little breeze kind of blowing through it. So that is not a problem at all. And I would just say this, my only reason for being as blatantly honest as I can is that one experience that I had where someone wasn't honest about claustrophobia. If you know that you have claustrophobia and a pretty serious condition of claustrophobia, you probably shouldn't do this. But if you think you could do it, and you might not like tight places, but something like this would be a real adventure, I would encourage you, consider it, at least think about it, and because it really is an Indiana Jones adventure. It's something that you will never forget. You can even buy shirts after the end. I made it through Hezekiah's tunnel.
The water shoe need to be on over the knee?
No. The only reason for water shoes is the bottom is more of a shape like this, and so the water shoes just give you a little more stability, but I wouldn't want you to go barefooted. I mean, I've never run into anything, debris or glass or anything in there, but in case you did, I wouldn't want you to run into that.
How long does it take when you're walking with the group to get through and out?
We use about 30 minutes,
Okay.
30 to 45 minutes, somewhere in that range. Everybody's always stopping for Kodak moments, and taking pictures and all that, which is great. So we don't push anybody, but it's about 30 minutes, something like that. to make it through. All right, and when you come to the end, the nice reprieve, I'll explain a little bit later, but there are parts of Hezekiah's tunnel that have a very high ceiling also. And in short, archaeologists agree that probably the reason for this is the digging of the tunnel in Hezekiah's day by his engineers was probably done along a fissure in the rock that already existed but could not have enough water pass through. So what they did is just widen that, and so therefore, and by the way, the most amazing engineering part of the feat is all the way through the tunnel. It goes at a 2 or 3% decline, so the water will always be running. And in order to do that was an amazing engineering feat, and that's also why you end up with a high ceiling at the one end. So some interesting things about the tunnel. If you are fascinated by this, you can look up online articles about Hezekiah's tunnel. It's a very, very interesting one. Now I mentioned the Hinnom Valley. This would be a picture of it. We're actually going to be very near it at the Dan Panorama Hotel that we stay in Jerusalem. The Hinnom Valley would have been where Solomon, later Manasseh, and other kings whose priorities had gotten way off base, where they set up all of the pagan worship, especially Solomon, to please his wives, because many of them imported the worship of their gods into the city. I was just teaching a class at our church this morning and just naming all the different gods and the wives who had allowed this to come in, and following Solomon, others after him had set up their worship, so that the name Hinnom is Hebrew, is the root word that became the word in Greek, Gehenna. Does anyone know the meaning of the word Gehenna? Gehenna is the Greek word for hell. So, and it's believed to be the fact of the detestable worship that took place in this valley, the Hinnom Valley, ultimately not only was the gates of hell, but also the fires that were burning, garbage fires and all of that took place here, were like the fires of hell as are pictured in Scripture and so forth. So it's a very, very powerful image that we have of the Hinnom Valley. All right. That is all that I have today for our Old Testament look at history. And as I said, next time, a month from now, we will pick up with the life of Jesus. Actually, I'll pick up with the Intertestament period. I do have a little bit more, so don't get too restless yet. A little bit more that I want to cover with you. And yeah, I think we will do this. Do you all have the white handout, the page on archaeology? Okay. Let me say just a little bit about archaeology, because as we travel, I won't expect you to have this whole education and background in archaeology, but it's very helpful to know a few things about archaeology as we are looking at things. First of all, looking at the white page, the front part of that, archaeology and the Bible. Archaeology is the science of excavation, decipherment or interpreting it, and then critical evaluation of man-made records of the past. That's a good definition, I think, of what archaeology is intending to do. Now, 3 purposes for archaeology given here. Archaeology illustrates, explains, and provides background to biblical history. Let me give you an illustration. From the time of the patriarchs, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, we can go to sites that existed not very far away, but in the culture area of the patriarchs. They now, by the way, are in the country of Iraq. So Iraq has some very important archaeological stuff. And tablets were discovered in several of the major ancient cities, which went into detail in all the cultural practices that took place. This would be not in the Bible, but it is archaeology that was discovered outside of the Bible. And in those stories, in those tablets, I should say, we have many things explained that help us to understand the patriarchal stories of Abraham, Isaac, Jacob. Let me give you an illustration. It's not as big a deal today, but Abraham and Sarah are, after they find out Sarah is barren, are looking to find a surrogate mother. They're looking to find someone else to have a child. Looking again at these artifacts that came out of that culture area, it was entirely normal, if you weren't able to carry on your family line, that you would look for a surrogate mother and try to produce a child for that family line. Now, we're not saying that God didn't have another plan in mind. What we are saying is that when Abraham and Sarah made that decision, they were doing things that were entirely in line with their culture, things that everyone would have done. Why would Isaac, when he is tricked it turned out not to be his deathbed, but it turned out that he was very sick. Remember when Jacob tricks him into thinking that he's Esau, and Isaac pronounces a blessing on Jacob, and then later on when he finds out that he's tricked, he says, I can't take it back. I can't. Well, why can't you take it back, Isaac? Well, the words of a man in a very ill situation like that were as binding as a contract that we might call a will today, a written will. So that in that culture we can find things by looking at parallel stories that help us to understand that. And I could go on and on, so much so that the patriarch stories make a lot more sense when we look at the archaeology that comes from that period of time. So archaeology illustrates and explains biblical history. Secondly, archaeology supplements biblical history. When I preach on Moses, for example, I like to also teach on a woman who became Pharaoh for a short time in Egypt. Her name was Hatshepsut. It's entirely found in Egyptian history. Became one of the most powerful women in Egyptian history. And ultimately, if you put the chronology together, I think a case can be made that Hatshepsut was the daughter of Pharaoh who took Moses under her wing and raised him within Egyptian culture. If we accept that, and there's speculation involved, but if we accept that, this powerful Egyptian woman would have had available to her all the resources to be able to allow Moses to have this tremendous education and put Moses into powerful positions. And so I think it really, as I said here, it supplements the biblical story in that it helps us to understand some of the background that might be there. We have to openly admit that some of these things we don't know for sure, but archaeology can provide some very, very useful things. Finally, third, it strengthens our confidence in biblical truth by confirming its historicity and its accuracy. Let me jump down to a point that is very important to understand. I love archaeology, but archaeology doesn't prove the Bible, because archaeology is always an interpretive science. And others can come along and say, well, I have a different interpretation. So don't try to build your faith totally on archaeology that it's somehow proven the Bible. Having said that, though, as I made the point here, what we learn from archaeology can certainly strengthen our faith in the scriptures and what they have to say. We will go a number of places in Israel where I think a case can be clearly made that Solomon and David in some cases would have built this. Do you know that there are many scholars today who don't even believe that Solomon existed as a king or as a person? The more liberal end of Judaism that is found in Israel would deny that David and Solomon were actually even historical characters. And yet the more we dig into the archaeology that is related to David and Solomon, the more we discover things that are right there in the Bible. And we pull out our Bibles and we say, wow, this archaeology doesn't prove the Bible, but it certainly gives me a great deal more confidence that this Bible in fact is true, and that David and Solomon are in fact historical characters, are historical characters. All right, let me do a few things with the next page. Oh, one other quick note here on the strengthening our confidence. We're going to make a stop at Qumran where the Dead Sea Scrolls were discovered, and you will actually sit and look and take pictures of the first cave out of which the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. We're also going to, in Jerusalem, go to the place where they're stored in Jerusalem today. And I'll tell you at that time a little bit of the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but the story of the Dead Sea Scrolls is an amazing support for the truthfulness of our Old Testament and the way that it's written. And I'll go into the story right now in the interest of time, but as we stop there at Qumran and talk about that, you will see that this archaeological discovery completely outside of the Bible, these Dead Sea Scrolls, actually have a lot of bearing on the trustworthiness of the Bible, right? We can really put a lot of confidence in it. And that's the points that I'm making here. Now, what is it, on the last page there, what does it tell? This is a good example of a tell. This is Megiddo. We're stopping there on our very first day. You can see it looks like a hill in the middle of a field. It's not a hill at all. Megiddo represents 26 levels of civilization that were destroyed and built on top of one another. So ultimately it becomes like a cone, if you will, and the excavations have cut off the top of that cone. And therefore that's what a tell is. It's a mound of human debris and destruction of an ancient town, and excavation has taken place. Takes us to the second term. A dig, an archaeological dig, is an excavation that is digging up a tell and trying to find out the information that we can find there in our discoveries. The stratum, or strata plural, would be the different layers that are found in the dig, in the tell. And so you can see even this look at Megiddo, which by the way is one of the greatest and oldest sites in Israel that was excavated. You can see that there are many different layers that archaeologists have dug up trying to identify what took place in these layers. And so a stratum is a definite archaeological and occupational level in a city. Now let me show you, going back to this picture I had up earlier. This area around this worship site would be a stratum. It would be a particular level that was happening at a certain time in history. And the reason that this was finally identified as a pagan worship site had to do with what was found around this particular place. As you might imagine, one theory originally was that this is a foundation for a tower, and there would have been a tower that would have been built on top of this. But no, archaeologists finally generally agreed this had to be a worship site. How did they know that? Because around it, they found petrified animal bones that would have been related to animal sacrifices that took place. Now this takes us to the next term, in situ. In situ is when an archaeologist finds an artifact in the place that it actually happened. Not that someone took and threw it out into another level, but that it actually took place there. So when they were identifying whether this was a worship site or a silo, one of the reasons is in situ around this were found petrified animal bones, which would indicate that this was a worship site, some kind of a pagan worship site, and therefore it would help them to identify. So in situ just means that it was found in its original setting. Something that we'll see not very often but a few places is what's called a reconstruction level. This is kind of hard to see maybe where you're sitting, but you see this line of cement or plaster that is put right around here? Whenever you see that, as we look at different archaeological sites, and we won't have a lot of them, but we'll have a few of them. This is called a reconstruction line. What it means is that everything below this was what was found as it existed in the dig And everything above this, the archaeologists rebuilt in order to allow the observer to picture what this wall might have looked like. So everything below the reconstruction line is the original, and everything above was for our convenience to picture it. There's another way that this sometimes is done. You can see here the rounded stones are the original, and then the archaeologists wanted us to see what these walls might have looked like, so there are modern stones that were placed along the top. And those techniques are used in archaeology because, after all, archaeology, the desire for many is that tourists would come and view it, and they would learn a lot by seeing the archaeology. So archaeologists try to do things that will help us to understand a bit. The probe trench, I have there that as one of the terms. And we're almost done here, so hang in with me. When Megiddo was first excavated, the probe trench was the accepted way to excavate a site like this. And what is a probe trench? It basically is like cutting a piece of pie. It's like cutting the big circle and cutting into it, and essentially removing everything in here, but examining what you might see on the sides of the probe trench. Now this was a great thing because all at once you could see all the levels at the same time. But there was a huge problem. In fact, it was such a big problem that archaeologists moved away from this method completely. What happens when you dig a probe trench? You destroy the position that all of the artifacts were in. And the best you could do is maybe to look at the edges and see some of them, but not a very good thing to do, because in the very act of digging this probe trench, they destroyed everything that was in the way of the digging. So you can see that after doing this huge probe trench, which still exists there today, you'll be able to see it. From that point on, archaeologists began to peel off layers like layers of an onion. They began to peel off layers. The disadvantage of that is it takes a long time. It takes a long time, and I've had some friends who have actually gone over to Israel and worked in archaeological digs during a summer. If you have any interest in doing this, they'll invite you to come over there and basically give you room and board just to work in these digs. But I'm here to tell you, I would never do this. It is so hot, for one thing, but it is just hard work. And it's not only hard work, but it's work that often doesn't have any payoffs for a long period of time. You might go a whole summer and never find anything significant in your archaeology work. So that kind of labor is not what I'm really interested in. I'm interested in finding out the results of it. Now, just a couple more terms and then we're done for today. First and Second Temple are common terms that you might run into in reading. We use the terms Old and New Testament, but First and Second Temple would be the common terms. The First Temple would represent Solomon's temple period until it was destroyed. And then the Second Temple period would be from the restoration of Zerubbabel's temple. That would be the Ezra and Nehemiah story. Ezra and Nehemiah at the end of the Old Testament. All the way through to Jesus' day when Herod, King Herod, we'll get to him next week, is beautifying the temple that existed. That was the Second Temple that stood from the time of Ezra and Nehemiah. And Herod now, whom the Jews hated, but Herod is going to beautify that temple and make it even more beautiful. We'll talk a little bit about that next week. So First and Second Temple are terms that you will often run into. Secondly, and probably not as important, but if you're reading science, these would be the dates of the Bronze Age. Abraham, for example, would be Middle Bronze in 2100, and there's early Bronze and late Bronze. And then the age to follow that is after iron was used in implements, you move on into the Iron Age. The Iron Age. All right. I'll tell you what I'd like to do. I wanted to honor leaving you out a little bit earlier before 4. If you have a concern about security issues, about news stories that haven't been as much recently as much as a few weeks ago about Iran, the saber rattling that is going on in the Mideast and all that. I'll be glad to stay and talk to you. I've talked to a couple of the folks traveling with us by email just to reassure them. Bottom line, I'm going to reassure you that travel to Israel always will involve international stories. I've never gone to Israel, but that there weren't stories in the news. But I would, right at this moment, including what happened a few weeks ago, I would take my kids and my grandkids to Israel, and I would feel like it's a very safe place to travel. I want to say something about security and those kinds of issues, especially on our third session. But if you're having concerns about that and just want to talk a little bit more, I'll be glad to do that. I can also fire you. I saved a copy of an email that I'd written to a couple people just explaining a little bit why does Hutchison think that this is a safe place to travel. I really do. I'm not exaggerating. I'm not just trying to hold you into the trip, but I really believe that we're going to somewhere that is a lot safer than a lot of American cities today. And that's because Israel understands security. They really do. They understand security. But I'll be glad to talk with you. So it's great being with you today. We have another one planned, I think, at the end of February. And so look forward to being with you on that day as well. Thanks.
Well, let's thank Neil Sale also.